But now let us turn to Psalms.
Yes,
And our very
Kodesh
yeah.
Tov, everyone. Today is the 1st of Av, which means that Elul is right around the corner. And we have a very, very special guest with us today, Niccolo Seligmann, who I met online this weekend as he was giving a presentation for my friends, the Five Borough Music Festival. I will not say anything more right now. I will let Niccolo play us in, and then we will turn it over to him for 15 minutes or so of what I'm sure is going to be an absolutely fascinating discussion. Niccolo, we have given you co-host opportunities, so if you want to share your screen or anything, do, but maybe you just like to play us in for a few minutes.
All right, thank you so much. So I unfortunately can't get the camera angle to include absolutely everything. First of all, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, yes.
Excellent. So I'm going to play us in on this instrument, which is called the psaltery. And this psaltery is what inspired this connection in the first place. So thank you so much for having me in your group, and I will show my thanks by playing a little piece on this instrument that brought me to you guys.
Maybe just a little closer to your microphone, Niccolo. You're a little
Yeah,
low.
is this better?
Much better, much better. Wow. And when we hear the description of David playing for Saul to calm his soul, I think that that is what I hear in my mind. So So Niccolo, everyone wanted to see the instrument, which I believe you were playing on your lap, right?
Yes, unfortunately, I don't have the kind of camera setup where I can switch easily. So it was put it in heart position or put it in psaltery position, and unfortunately, right now it's in heart position. I can kind of show by getting up closer to the camera. Um, the way I hold it on my lap. I'm on a very short stool. I'm on a little kindergarten stool. So that when my knees are bent, they're at a 90-degree angle, and the psaltery can lie perfectly flat. Now,
Got
the
it.
psaltery is lying perfectly flat, and I have in both hands, I have these little vulture feather plectra. Now, plectrum is the singular. It's just a fancy word for pick, like a guitar pick. A guitar pick is one kind of plectrum. And the ones I'm using two of these, one in each hand, and they are made of vulture feather. No vultures were harmed. I just find them all over my place. They live in the woods. So I have a somewhat unending supply of psaltery plectra. And using plectra to pluck strings goes back a long, long way. So ostensibly the reason that I was brought in for today's meeting is to talk about the harp and the psaltery. In Psalm 150, we talk about praising God with psaltery and lyre, or sometimes you see it translated as harp and lyre, sometimes you see it as harp and psaltery, sometimes you see lyre and psaltery. Is this better?
Yes, yes. It's just, I don't know if it's the directionality of your microphone or you're a little quiet. If you could just speak a
Give me
little
one second. I'm just going to turn the gain up on my
louder. Turn
microphone
up
so
the
that I
gain.
don't have to be like right up on it.
Things I will walk away from this pandemic
Right,
with.
right, right.
Is
Okay.
this any better?
Oh, much better. Thank you.
Awesome.
Turning up the gain always helps.
Yes, turn up the gain. That's my motto. Um, Similar to a dulcimer. Great question. So it is similar to a dulcimer in terms of kind of the basic technology. It's a box with a lot of strings on it. But there are a couple of big differences. First of all, with a hammered dulcimer, as opposed to the Appalachian dulcimer, that's a totally unrelated, different instrument, the hammered dulcimer is struck with little wooden hammers. Um, and it's still a box with strings on it, but because you're striking it with hammers, if you were to do that on this instrument, you can see that all of the strings are the same height off of the sound table. That's our word for the top soundboard on this instrument. It is similar to auto harp. I'll get there. I'll get there. So a hammered dulcimer, if you were to just hammer this, there's no possible way to hit one string at a time. You'd be hitting lots and lots of strings at a time. So a hammered dulcimer, instead of flat strings like this, like a psaltery, they're kind of canted like this, and they're kind of woven in between each other. So that way you can hit just the string you want to hit. The main difference between this and as an auto harp, and I'm sure the person that um, commented that recognized the shape of this instrument. This is actually a traditional American shape for this instrument. This is not an ancient shape. Most of what I do is medieval music, and I'm kind of just getting my toes wet with music of the ancient world. But both this harp, which is actually technically a Celtic harp, and the psaltery, which is technically an American style psaltery, both of these are the current iteration of these very ancient instruments. There are a couple people out there who are building and playing them in the ancient style. That's a whole zone of scholarship that I'm only just getting my feet wet in. Yes, someone raised their hand.
So the way we do this is I will recognize people. We don't want to interrupt you in the middle, so feel free to talk, and then we'll take questions. You don't have to answer all of
And
them.
just
Okay.
ignore the
Yeah,
chat.
I'll ignore the chat.
Ignore the chat. Harold
We'll
will keep
chat
an eye
and
on the
talk, and then
chat. You just check.
I'll run interference for you.
Yeah.
So if the main question I'm here to answer today is what could the quinoa and the
Yeah, Val.
Nivelle, what could they possibly have sounded like? Well, there are a couple of options, and these options present to us through different plucked string traditions from around the world. So I'm going to move over to the harp right now. Yeah, with the psaltery, I think whether or not it was plucked with fingers or with plectra, that's kind of the main difference that there may be in that. I've played many different psalteries with different shapes, And I got to say, the shape of the instrument doesn't really affect the sound nearly as much as whether or not you're playing it with your fingers or with plectra. And just for reference, I'll actually just pick up that psaltery again and play a little bit with my fingers so that you can hear the difference. Versus, well, I've moved the mics now, but you can still get a little bit of a sense. So that's a pretty different sound. And not only does it change what the instrument itself sounds like, it changes what you can do on it. I think nowadays, a lot of medieval performers on the harp will often perform in this style called basically melody and accompaniment, where they're playing the melody in their right hand, and you'll hear me doing this later, and then they're doing some kind of rhythmic or harmonic thing with their left hand. On the psaltery, you can do that with your fingers just fine. But once you have the picks in your hands, it's a lot easier and a lot more natural feeling to play just the melody without accompaniment, but highly ornamented. It's very easy to do very florid sounding ornamentation. So I think if we're kind of trying to reconstruct what psalm accompaniment might have been on these instruments, the different roles they have to play, whether it's just melody, whether it's melody plus accompaniment, or just accompaniment, that's really important information. And whether or not they used plectra can help us kind of make that call. So we're all basically familiar with what we are now familiar with as the sound of the harp. But that familiar harp sound might not have been historically what they might have heard in ancient Israel. There are many different harp traditions, including the one that I'm most familiar with, which is the medieval harp practice, that use a technology called braise. And before I play on my harp myself, I'll just drop a YouTube link in the chat, because I'm not sure that if I play YouTube directly from my computer that the sound will work out right. So I'll just drop the YouTube link in the chat for an instrument called the begena.
Right, and I can put this on our Facebook page later where everybody can listen to it.
Yes, please. So this instrument, the begena, this is an actual lyre. Unfortunately, I have over 100 instruments in this room with me right now, and unfortunately, none of them are a lyre. And the main difference between a psaltery, a harp, and a lyre is the relationship between the strings and the soundboard. As you can see on the psaltery, the soundboard runs parallel under the strings, whereas with the harp, oh, my body's in the way. But as you can see with the harp, the strings are running this way and the sound table is running this way, so it's perpendicular. I am not at all claiming that these are reproductions of biblical instruments. There are some reproductions of biblical instruments out there, but honestly, most of them are not from Judea. A lot of them are from Babylonia, from Egypt, from ancient Sumer, but there's not a whole lot of information that we have about these instruments. I think in some ways more helpful than the reconstructions of ancient instruments are traditions like the begena, where it is an unbroken tradition from biblical times and has been passed down through the generations to us today. Obviously, there have been lots and lots of changes, but I think a combination of studying these historical instruments and the reconstructions that we've been able to come up with and these living traditions, I think that that gives us a clearer picture of what it might have sounded like than if we just look at one or the other. So thank you for bringing up the reproductions thing. These are not what these instruments would have looked like, but they might sound similar to what they sounded like. The basic technology is the same. So, sorry, I'm getting a little rambly here. So we've got the psaltery, where the strings and the soundboard, they're parallel. We've got the harp, where they're coming at each other at a right angle. It's kind of hard to demonstrate like that. And then with a lyre, you get a little bit of both. If you click on the Begena link, you can see that there is, like a harp, there's a big frame. And like a psaltery, there's a sound table. There's a body of the instrument where the strings are running kind of directly across it like that. So a lyre really kind of represents both of those families, and maybe it's helpful when we're kind of when we're arguing about whether a kinnor and a navel are harps or psalteries or lyre or what. Maybe it's more helpful to think of harp to psaltery as a sliding scale, as a spectrum of which the middle portion consists of lyres. I am going to play a little bit on this harp so that you can hear the brays that I'm talking about. If you clicked on that Begena link, you'll probably, the surprise will have been spoiled.
I'm going to suggest that you just listen here, and then we'll put the Begena link on our Facebook page, and we can go back later and listen to it.
Awesome. In that case, I'll give a little quick introduction to what I'd like you to listen for. So the Begena, part of the sound of the Begena, can you guys tell that I really, really want one? The characteristic sound, it's kind of a bzow, bzow sound instead of the like ting that we associate with a harp or a lyre. That bzow comes from technology called brays. Now, brays are little pins, generally they're wood, and they sit on the end of a string, either at the top or the bottom, usually the bottom, and you set them so that they are almost touching the string, but not quite. And that way, proto-electric guitar, it does sound a little bit like distortion. That way, when you pluck the string, it hits that bray pin like whap, 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 really fast and sounds kind of like distortion. It has a very kind of bray donkey sound, and that's actually where the term to harp on someone comes from, because it's only since the 17th, 18th centuries that a harp was considered a pretty or feminine instrument. It was originally considered kind of in the same category as a bagpipe, because I mean, these brays, it sounds really crazy. So what I've done is I have these tuning levers, because it's a Celtic harp, and that's typical. I have placed some of the tuning levers in the bottom register so that they function as brays. So when I pluck the string, it will have that sound, but only for the bottom. So listen for my low notes. See if you can hear that buzz. I'll just demonstrate on the very lowest note, which you can really hear it. That's like pretty different, right? From this. So that's kind of what we expect from a harp sound, but it may just as likely have been more like this. So I will now play a quick piece called Belle Douette. This is a 13th century French lament, and this one made my mother-in-law cry. It is about the Duchess, the Princess, the Baroness. She receives a message from a courier that her husband has been killed in a joust, not war, a joust. Sitar using brays, I'll get there.
Okay, guys, please just stay off the chat, okay? Wow. Beautiful.
So that's a pretty palpable difference between the strings that have the braze and strings that haven't. Give me a thumbs up if you feel like you could really hear the difference.
Yes.
Okay, I can't actually see anybody. Sorry, I was switching to tile view, but I'm going to assume that everyone had
Totally,
enthusiastic
absolutely.
thumbs out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Awesome. So we've got, at this point, right, we've got four sounds that may have been referenced by Kinor and Navel. We've got psaltery with plectra, and of course I'm using psaltery in the broadest sense, just meaning an instrument where the strings are entirely contained on the soundboard. There's no frame like a harp or a lyre, and the soundboard runs parallel to the strings. So a psaltery with plectrum, a psaltery with fingers, and then we've got harp with braze and harp without braze. It's kind of unlikely that they were using a harp with a plectrum. I've tried that. It's hard. It's not easy. And it's not natural. It doesn't feel very natural the way it does in the psaltery. And of course, the way what feels kind of somatically, corporeally natural to me is not necessarily what felt natural to the bodies of ancient Jews. Um, but I'm using kind of the evidence of how my body interacts with these instruments. Um, I think this is maybe a good place for me to kind of stop with the output and take some questions.
So one of the questions that I discussed was, obviously the Psalms have words or lyrics, and psalm comes from the Greek psalmos, which is a lyrical song accompanied by a stringed instrument. Would these be used traditionally to accompany a singer, or would they be solo instruments?
Oh, they would almost definitely be used to accompany a singer. The idea of kind of soloistic instrumental performance, as a genre, that's a relatively new idea. In Western Europe, that's largely a new idea. There are instrumental soloistic traditions that go back very far, primarily in Central Asia. When I was just starting medieval music, my main mentor basically said, you know, before kind of capitalism and before the end of feudalism, medieval and before, there were basically two kinds of music: a song and a dance. And if it's not one of those two, who knows? But there, and that is largely true. That is largely true, and that does cut across many different musical traditions. There are some outliers, such as steppe cultures in Central Asia, living on the grassland. They have an instrumental improvisation tradition that goes back who knows how long. But as far as they were used for in the ancient Jewish temple, I think it was a lot more likely that they were used as vocal accompaniment rather than as instrumental soloists. I think it's likely that there were probably some kind of intro and outro, prelude and postlude, if you will, because one, if it's a different singer than the harpist, the singer needs to know what note they're supposed to come in on. That doesn't change throughout the years. You want that first note to sound right. So there were probably times in the ancient temple where a solo string instrument was heard, but that was probably not the whole performance. Now, I'm not singing any songs along with that, partly because this is an instrument-focused talk, and partly because that is horrifying to me. I'm not a great singer.
All right. Lisa Brown has had her hand up for quite a while. Lisa is a music historian and spoke to us about the instruments of the Psalms. Lisa, can you unmute yourself?
Hi, Nicola, wonderful. Thank you for playing for us today. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about ornamentation and specifically about style and ornamentation. And if you can speak a little bit about where your ornaments come from and if they're language derived or anything that you might think about in terms of how you shape your notes as you play your melodies.
That's a really, really great question. So this is actually something that Harold and I were talking about kind of the other day. So the fact that these are instruments with many strings where you don't change the length of the string. And I'm making that distinction as opposed to instruments like the lute, the oud family, the guitars, the fiddle family instruments. You can see a couple of them behind me there. With those instruments, you can slide around. You can have notes that the note starts at one pitch and ends at another pitch. And we're all familiar with this from blues. In blues, da-da-da-dum, da-dum. That slide is very common in blues, and it's also very common in historical writings from ancient Greece and ancient Mesopotamia about music. We have reason to believe that discrete notes were not the only kinds of notes, that there were also sliding notes, kind of like that blues, and that is something that you can only do on a voice or on a string instrument where the strings are changing length. On harps and psalteries, you can't do that. So there may have been several different languages of ornamentation going on between the voice and between these instruments. My ornamentation language is largely, honestly, it's largely derived from what works and is easy on these instruments. Perfect example on the psaltery. Hold on, let me see if I can get a taller chair so you can see what I'm doing. Ooh, hopefully this will be easy to see. Ooh, almost. All right, it's going to be a little crazy, but... So, yeah, I'll turn it a little bit maybe so that you can see it a little better. Ooh. All right. Sorry, this is a little crazy. But I definitely want you guys to be able to see what I'm doing here. So, there we go. So, when I'm plucking, I'm actually only plucking in one direction. It is not easy. Here, let me get my picks correct. So I'm holding my picks, I'm holding my plectrum like this, between thumb and forefinger. And I'm not really ever plucking this way. I'm only ever plucking towards me, so. See that? So because of that, it's very easy for me to do these kind of swipes that go from a higher note to the note that you're aiming for, and then to the one below, and then with the other hand you grab that one. So I could do, let's see, there we go, it's gotta be lower. So I could do, or I could do swipe, so you notice that it's always going down. It's never, it's always. And that comes from the direction I'm plucking. If I were to like put my shoulders forward and my elbows forward, then maybe I could have as much facility and ease going in the wrong direction as in the correct direction. But that's really not easy on the body, and it makes other things harder. The way I learned how to play the psaltery, honestly, is by watching my friends who play the Arabic descendant of the psaltery, which is called the kanun, which I just love because the word kanun means the law. And so a kanun, so for each one of my strings, a kanun has 3 strings placed very close together. So it takes a long time to tune. So whatever the kanun is tuned to, that is the law, and everyone else better tune to the kanun because she's not retuning. So I just kind of love that kanun means law, and we actually see that word in the word canon, C-A-N-O-N. So watching kanun players' technique has been very informative for me, and most kanun playing, now they do sometimes pluck the other way, but it's an exception that proves the rule. Generally, kanun players are playing towards their bodies. And if you listen to Qanun ornamentation, they're doing a lot of that kind of downward swipe thing that I'm doing. One thing that's very tricky on both of these instruments is making sure that the ornaments are lighter weight. And by lighter weight, I don't just mean quieter. I also mean just like less bodily force is put behind it. It's very important that they're lighter weight than the main note. Otherwise, you can't tell what the melody is. So the tunes that I played for you on this, I played a highly ornamented version of what's otherwise a very simple melody. There are a couple of reasons one might want to include ornaments. A lot of these instruments are very quiet, and if you have more notes, then you're louder. On these bowed instruments, generally I'm playing a drone alongside what I am, the melody that I'm playing, and the purpose of that is to just be louder. So if you have more notes happening, then you're going to be louder. And imagining kind of the sonic world of the original Jerusalem temple, like it was probably, there was a lot of ambient sound, probably a lot coming from outside. If it was a particularly echoey space, then any movement in the audience is going in the congregation is going to echo and contribute to that ambient sound. So as an instrumentalist, you have to cut through that sound.
So, Niccolo, do you think there's any evidence of bowed strings instruments being played at this time?
No.
Okay.
The first bowed strings that we have evidence for comes from the 7th and 8th centuries in Central Asia, in those steppe cultures that also come up with some of the world's first instrumental narrative improvisation traditions. However, in ancient Rome, there were hurdy-gurdy instruments. If you're familiar with the hurdy-gurdy, using a cranked wheel instead of a separate horsehair bow to vibrate the strings. They had that technology a lot older than they had horsehair technology, and it's really only because of these cultures that rely heavily on horses, talking about the steppe cultures, that we really start to see a stick with horsehair on it as a way to make sound.
Wow. Rabbi, do you have any questions?
I'm just in awe because, I mean, I've been reading these Psalms, as everybody knows, for many years, and the idea, this gives so much richness to those superscriptions that are giving instructions clearly to what instrument the author is imagining these words should now be played to. We don't know exactly what they're meaning, but we understand to have this audio in my ear now really will change the Psalms for me.
Oh, and I've just realized I've left out one more instrument before I go. If you guys want to take a slight diversion.
Yeah, we have until 10:45, so it's all yours.
Okay, well, I don't want to. All right. Because I know you have other things on the agenda.
No, you are it. You are it.
Okay. So, other things that come up, other instruments that come up, particularly in Psalm 150, is the idea of cymbals. Now, they had cymbals similar to what we think of as an orchestral cymbal, but you don't see those represented in iconography nearly as often as you see an instrument called the sistrum. And that's S-I-S-T-R-U-M. I'll let you guys look that up. Another thing that you guys see, or that one sees in the iconography a lot more often than you see round symbols, is you see a lot of triangles. The triangle goes back a very long way, and it can tell us some more about kind of the musical priorities of ancient cultures. Notice that this triangle has these rings. So just in the same way that putting a bray on your harp or putting heavy ornamentation on your psaltery adds sound and makes you louder, adding these kind of extra things like rings or like the brays just creates more vibration that will cut through more ambient sound. So when we think of the triangle, we kind of think of a gentle ding, right? Well, in the ancient world, they might have sounded a little more like this. So you can hear the way those rings rattle. It creates kind of a dirty sound. And I think that's important for us now to recognize because what we think of as clean sounding playing and clean music is really only dates back to the beginning of recording.
Ah.
Oh. So Shep has had his hand up. Shep, you have a question?
Yeah, I have a very practical question. Well, two questions. What got you into all this? It's amazing. And can you perform at synagogue for special occasions?
Um, I, I, I think I understood your question. I had a little trouble hearing you. You're asking if,
What brought you into this?
Yeah.
And then have you ever performed this music in synagogue?
so I grew up in a Reformed synagogue in Richmond, Virginia, and my first instrument was cello. So they would kind of, I would get trotted out as the cute kid cellist. So I have performed in synagogues before. I've performed in synagogues as an adult, largely performing Sephardic music on these medieval instruments. But as far as kind of recreating the ancient psalmody traditions, that's not something that I've done until now, and it's something I would love to continue doing. Medieval improvisation techniques can also translate very well into music of the ancient world, even though we don't know a lot about what they were doing. The kind of somatic approach that I take can give us a lot of clues.
Where do you live? Where are you located at?
I live in Westminster, Maryland, in the middle of the woods, with a very low ambient sound level. It's great. But when there's no global pandemic going on, I am in New York about 2 weeks out of every month, generally, just
Now,
with gigging work.
we have a question from Janine Edmei Hakim. If I may ask, are these instruments kissing cousins of those used by today's traditional Sephardic musicians and orchestras? And our cantorial intern actually comes from the Sephardic tradition and plays the oud for us. So
Fantastic. Absolutely. These instruments are absolutely related to the instruments used in Sephardic performance. So within the mode of music making that I work in is generally kind of lumped in as early music, or the term I prefer, which is historically informed performance. And for some reason, it's become something of a fad for early music ensembles and performers to perform Sephardic music on medieval instruments. I think kind of conjuring this kind of mythologized idea of a Spain that welcomed Jews. And that's not really historical. I mean, they were probably not playing these 19th and early 20th century Sephardic songs on instruments like this, but it's become its own performance practice within early music. So I think it's valid. It's just not something that happened in history. That being said, I mean, these instruments, specifically this one, is one of the nearer, in terms of history, ancestors to the violin. So when you hear a violin in Sephardic music, it is absolutely a descendant of this instrument, which is called the viol. The oud, that goes back, we don't know how far it goes back, but it was definitely in use in medieval times.
So we have one more question, then I have a tiny bit of housekeeping, and then we'll ask you to play us out. Ellen Poster says, can you put your finger down on the psaltery like against a violin fingerboard? Or the harp? And I think the answer is no. The strings are of a specific length, and that is the length. You cannot do that.
That's correct. There are the instruments that are set up to do that well are the instruments with a neck. If you want to shorten the length of a string, then you do that via the neck. And actually, I have a good example of kind of a midway point instrument called the cruth. And if you go on my YouTube channel, I actually have a whole informational video on the cruth. The cruth is a bowed lyre. It is a lyre, and it looks like a lyre, but instead of just kind of an empty frame like that, there's a fingerboard that runs down through it. And you do shorten the strings on that instrument. But at that point, the cruth is kind of a midway instrument between a lyre and a fiddle. So I don't think it really has that much bearing on what they were doing in the ancient temples. I think it was probably just open strings, unshortened strings.
So we are almost at time, and I'm going to just we have a few housekeeping announcements. Rabbi Kleinbaum will not be with us tomorrow. She has a funeral to attend. Lisa Brown has very, very generously offered on short notice to give us the second part of her talk about historical instruments. So she will be with us tomorrow. I'm not sure whether or not I'm going to be here, but we will have Bruce and Babette to help Lisa out. Rabbi Kleinbaum will be back with us on Monday for her last day before her break, and we will go through I hopefully will go through the rest of the offerings from Psalm 9. And so Niccolo has put in some things in chat, and I will also make him an honorary member of our Facebook page so he can post some things on Facebook. And Niccolo, we cannot thank you enough.
And we want his YouTube channel. Is
Right.
it as simple as to put his name into the YouTube?
It's all in
It
chat.
is.
Oh, good. It's all in chat. Okay, I'm not.
And I actually just dropped the link. I was talking about the Kruth, this bowed lyre instrument. I actually just dropped the link to that specific video in the chat, so you can just.
So our tradition is that the last thing we have here is music. So we will say the most deeply heartfelt appreciations for your generosity in doing heartfelt. So I only met Niccolo over the weekend, and he put this together really, in a day. We can't thank you enough, and we will now turn it over to you for your choice on what you would like to play us out with. What music you
We're
would
so
like
grateful to you.
hear.
This is fabulous. Thank you so much, Niccolo.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been an absolute joy. Your questions are all so so knowledgeable and so well thought out. I really appreciate that. I'm going to play us out on harp. I'm going to do a quick, it's kind of my version of looking at kind of what else might there have been other than just like some pretty chords under a melody. What kind of polyphonic things might have been going on. So this is what's called a Cantiga de Santa Maria. It's a story of St. Mary's miracles, but that's only because that's what I happen to have learned on the harp. I'll come out to you guys about something very personal. I started learning the harp in quarantine, so I'm relatively new at it, actually. I play 60 plus other instruments, but I am only kind of just getting into the world of harp. So you guys get to see
Well, many of us have just started studying the Psalms in quarantine, so we're all experiencing new learnings.
So this particular one tells the story of there is a young girl in this small Spanish village, and she is possessed by the devil to say mean things to her mother. And so her mother takes her to the priest, who invokes the Virgin Mary, because that's the main solution to problems. And the Virgin Mary actually dives into the young girl's heart, punches the devil in the face, and yes, this is illustrated in the manuscript, and the devil flies out of the girl's heart, and she no longer says mean things to her mother.
Wow. Very practical.
Sorry, let me quick turn these off now.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. All right, everybody.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you, Nicole. You've added so much to our lives.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me here.
And when we reopen, you need to come visit us at our home on 30th Street.
Oh, I would
We're gonna
love,
have a whole
love
Psalms
that.
festival.
Yes.
We're going to have a whole Psalms festival.
We'll keep in touch with that. All right. Lisa tomorrow and the Rabbi on Monday and Rosh Chodesh Tov for Av. And goodbye, everyone. Have a great day.
Have a great day, everyone. Thank you again.